Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Vivian. So I am an anthropologist who is primarily interested in the aspects, both separately and the intersections of religion, mythology, and popular culture. So today I'm going to be focusing a lot more on the mythology side than the religion side, but religion might pop up here and there because I love it. And I'm also going to be talking a lot about a particular form of popular culture, which is the internet and online storytelling. I just recently finished, and by recently, I mean about a year ago, finished my PhD, which was specializing in studying online storytelling, primarily monster storytelling, with a focus on the Slender Man as online mythology. Analyzing it, telling it, figuring out what it means, what it's saying, all of that fun stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that kind of stuff today with a more focus on the monster side, with also not just the Slender Man, but also one or two other monsters, primarily one other one as we get into it. But before we get kind of into the nitty gritty with it, I kind of wanted to set up a little bit about my background, a little bit about how I approach the study of mythology, the study of popular culture, the study of the internet, so you can kind of understand a little bit about how I'm looking at things, why I'm looking at things the way that I am, that kind of stuff, just so you can get a little bit of a better idea. So when I was kind of first starting to get into different scholarly debates, especially as a student, and I was kind of starting to go into that world, I really hated definitions. I used to try to avoid them in my essays and stuff, which was always a knock against me because I wouldn't define my terms, because I always found it really boring. I didn't really like it. And I found that definitions were very based off of what people kind of typically thought of a particular idea even before they started doing the process. And this was particularly true of religion, which I was in a religious studies department. So obviously ideas of what a religion was and what a religion wasn't was very based off of what people already had a preconceived notion of religion being, i.e. Christianity, because I was in the US. So that was a lot of the particular ideas that people were coming into. And I didn't really like that. I thought it was very ethnocentric, and I saw definitions as very policing of borders. They would kind of be as a way of closing off a particular area of study and saying, well, this is what I'm looking at, and I'm not looking at what's over there because this is what I'm looking at based off of my definition. I found that really restrictive. I find definitions in general really restrictive. So what I decided to do instead was to play with definitions, to use definitions like a tool and almost like a game sometimes, rather than as something very firm and very set. So my definitions can move depending on what I'm finding and what I'm looking at and what my study is pertained to. So when we're kind of dealing with these definitions, I like to play with them like rubber bands. I did notice this morning that this slide looks like a lot of pasta. But it's supposed to be a bunch of rubber bands. It's just a fun little image that I found. But basically what I would like to do is take a definition almost like a rubber band. And when you first get a rubber band, it can be kind of small, but you can move it. But you might not get it to move very much. But then as you kind of work it and as you play with it and as you continue to kind of push it, it starts to grow and it starts to get bigger and it starts to kind of push its own boundaries and start to get even bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it gets to the point where it's so tight and so big that it might snap at any given moment. And that's when I like to stop with my definition. And I like to kind of sit there and go, what's here? Now that I've pushed the word religion at its biggest, at its broadest, at its weirdest, what is here? I do that with mythology as well. What is here? And I find that what the conversation ends up being is not what is religion or what is a myth, but rather what can religion be? What can a myth be? So focusing on the myth side, my question became, what can a myth be? What can it be when we're really looking at what a myth is doing, what its function is, what it's serving for a particular community? And I found a lot of popular culture. And a lot of times when people would define things in particular myth, but religion has this as well at times, of when it was a very broad definition, one of the criticisms was always leveled against of, well, popular culture can fit into that. A movie can fit that definition. A TV show can fit that definition. So it clearly doesn't work. But I, as I'm sure you can guess, I don't see that as a negative. And in fact, what I would do is say that if the particular thought is that, well, that can't be myth because that doesn't fit my view of myth, then maybe your view of myth needs to shift a little bit, or maybe you need to really think about why do you think it doesn't work, and really criticize that and really think really hard about that rather than just dismissing offhand because it's not what you initially conceived of something as being. So for me, a myth is something that a community or an individual uses in order to understand themselves and the world around them. And this is something that people use popular culture all the time to do. And if we're seeing myth as something that is that inherently important to somebody, then that's something that you can find in all sorts of different weird places. Because essentially, myth is not something that's really old. We always think of it as these really old stories and these very static stories, like the Prose Edda. And we think of these things as stuff that kind of lives in that time. And that for some reason, at some point in time in history, humans stopped telling myths. I don't know why we would have stopped, but apparently we did at some point. I don't really follow that. I think we're constantly in a state of mythologizing. We're constantly interacting with narratives in very meaningful ways. And that's something to really pay attention to. So I choose to see a lot of popular culture, a lot of popular literature as forms of mythology that is happening right now in today that people are currently engaging with and telling and connecting to. And so obviously when we're looking at popular culture, we look at the internet. And I found the internet as such an interesting place to look at mythology because it was the place where mythology, you could kind of see it happening in real time. You could see storytelling happening in real time, and you could see the growth of a narrative happening in real time, and you could see people engaging with it and create and having these spin-offs and having new views of things. And it was such a fascinating kind of aspect of a story that it's very difficult to see it elsewhere. You don't really get that with the Iliad. You don't really see people's responses to the Iliad and their own fan versions of it in quite the same way as you do with popular culture, and particularly with the internet. So yeah, I started looking at the internet in that way. But when we're talking about stories more generally, we kind of have to talk about monsters because so many stories have monsters. We've been telling stories about monsters for as long as we've been telling stories. So I wanted to take a little bit of time again to kind of explain the background of monsters and monstrosity, how people go about studying it, and how we analyze monsters, what we're looking for when we're analyzing monsters, because that's what I'm going to be focusing on when I'm talking about my analysis, obviously. So monsters are typically things that break categories. So we start to grow up in life and we categorize things, and we typically categorize things based off of our social standpoints, off of our cultural backgrounds. All of these things have their own ways of categorizing. And this is stuff that is taught to us by our parental units, whoever they may be. And as we go about the world, we get pointed to things, they get categories, and we kind of file those away into our categorical system in our social brains. Monsters are the things that break those categories. So we've got nice, neat categories of what each type of animal is, where the categories of geography is, even categories of the us versus them. Those are all categories we've built up in our brains. And monsters are the ones that break those categories. And when those categories break, they can be incredibly socially frightening. So that hybridization that breaks categories can happen in the way that a monster looks. And I don't know why I always think of the griffin as the very first example every single time I'm talking about hybrid monsters, because there are so many of them that exist. But I always think of the griffin first, so I have a picture of the griffin. The griffin is this kind of part eagle, part lion. And so it's breaking these kind of categories of bird versus mammal, of eagle versus lion, and of air versus land. So you have all these different categories that are all normally kept very separate in our social categorizing, but then the griffin breaks it. The other picture that I have is supposed to be of a vampire. I was trying to fit the romancing the gothic theme by having a nice picture of the vampire that might fit that. But a vampire doesn't necessarily look like they are a hybridized monster. So monsters don't always have to look like it. But the vampire is still breaking those categories. And the primary one that the vampire is breaking is the difference between the living and the dead. So the living is always kept separate from the dead. We've seen these categories, we build them up as we grow up. And when something breaks those categories, that's a problem. Although not always a problem. I always like to mention that not everything that breaks categories, well, I would say that everything that breaks categories is a monster, but not all monsters are bad. So Jesus, for example, is a monster, but a good monster for Christians, I should specify, where he breaks the categories of the divine and the human, which is normally kept very separate, and the categories of the living and the dead, which are kept very separate. But he breaks them, but it's important to note that he breaks them in a very different way than, say, a vampire breaks the categories. And so in those ways, when you really look at those categories, then that's why you see that some monsters are seen as positive monsters and some are negative. It's the way that the categories are breaking. So when we're analyzing things, it's not just, oh, a category is broken, it's a monster, we can move on. We have to kind of look at how a category is being broken, why it's being broken in that way, and why that is therefore scary or not scary. And I could get into very long, detailed storytelling about why Jesus broke certain categories when it comes into the history of things, but it's way tangential. But if you're interested, let me know, because I do like it. But yeah, so these monsters are breaking categories. So when we go to study digital monsters, like all the other monsters, are breaking categories. They're breaking different social categories that we've built up from a social standpoint. And this is why some monsters in a completely different culture than your own might not seem scary to you. Because it's not breaking your particular cultural categories. But in the same sense, you might have a monster that is super scary to you now in your life, or at a different point in your life that maybe wasn't before, or maybe you find another one. Things can kind of shift around because our social categories are constantly shifting. And likewise, monsters and stories are also likewise shifting as we go. So when we come to studying digital monsters, I'm looking at what they're breaking and why they're breaking them and why that's interesting. So the very first one that I want to talk to you about today is the Slender Man. This is the one that I spent quite a lot of time dealing with, quite a lot of my time in my life with. I'm very close to the Slender Man. And the Slender Man is a really fascinating character for particular studies of digital monsters. He's been around for a really long time. He's not quite as scary as he used to be, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is later in the talk. But he's probably one of the biggest figures in creepypasta, and that's the horror storytelling online for those who are unfamiliar with that term, which, oh, in retrospect, maybe I could have just kept saying that first one was pasta in order to be it like the creepypasta. But he's one of the biggest figures in creepypastas that's really hung around for a long time, and is probably one of the figures that most people not in those communities would recognize. And so that's one of the reasons why I picked him, because there's something really interesting going on with him. So for people who are unaware, the Slenderman story started in 2009 in the Something Awful forums, which used to be a really huge forum site kind of on the levels of Reddit and 4chan and stuff like that back in the early internet days. And there was a forum thread that popped up there that was called Let's Create Paranormal Images. And someone wanted to start having a load of people kind of creating those, like when people take pictures and it's like, oh, I caught a ghost on camera, and you see things, it's kind of grainy and you can't really tell whether or not it's a ghost and it's just a bit funky. They wanted to create those images that weren't very clearly defined as to what was happening, but they were weird. And so that was kind of the whole thing. So I think like 3 or 4 days into this thread existing, a user by the name of Victor Surge posted up 2 images, one of which is the image on the right. And he dubbed his monster in these pictures the Slender Man. And they were both kind of weird. They all involved children in the images, and they were marked as pictures that were taken on the days when loads of children disappeared. So if you can see up in the corner of the one in the right, I tried to make the image a little bit bigger so you could actually see the Slender Man in it when it was on the slide. But up in the corner, it was supposed to say City of Sterling Libraries on it. So it's actually been marked as if it's from an actual library's archives. And basically the story that accompanied this image when it popped up was that he found this in some library's archives, and this is where this image resides. And most of the images for the Slender Man were very similar to this format, where you had a very normal looking photo, a photo that is typically would not really be that interesting in any other circumstance, except for the fact that somewhere in the background was a creepy figure called the Slender Man. And you can kind of see him there. He looks like a kind of tall dude. It's hard to tell exactly how tall in this picture, but there's something weird going on because there's like weird tentacle things, maybe not tentacles. There's something not human going on with this guy in the image. And that was kind of what it always was. It was something kind of weirdly inhuman, something off, always in the background. And then something about this image really captured a lot of people's imaginations, and people started posting their versions of the Slender Man, and they started to even shift even within this forum thread's life. One of the other photos that is from the forum thread is actually the one on the left. This one was from a user by the name of Guyver Mac, and he wanted to mimic the old German woodcuts from like the 1600s. And this one is actually taken from an old German woodcut. So the original has the same exact all the elements of it, but except for the skeleton monster, it was a witch taking the kid. So he took out the witch and then put in this weird skeleton monster in a very similar styling to the old one, and kind of posted it up along with this art history blurb about the guy who made the German woodcuts and how he went missing and weird stuff like that. So again, there's an image that comes along with a type of historical reference point, as well as a kind of shifting of the original picture. So a Photoshop that kind of comes with a fun story that connects it to some kind of historical event, and then you post that up. So these are, I think, are 2 pretty good examples of the types of stories you would get on the Something Awful forums. It was always an image, well, not always an image, but when it was an image, it was accompanied with some kind of story as to how it was from a historical figure or a historical event, what that historical event was, and then you would kind of move on. And so people who weren't as skilled in Photoshop or as good at drawing or things like that started to want to get involved. So they started writing. And so you had all sorts of different writing versions of things. So you would have people writing government documents that they would then do their like redaction on. And so some people would just write it out like it was on a forum thread. So on forum threads, particularly on the Something Awful forum, you could do a spoiler tag and it would look like a big black censor bar. So they would put that in places. So as you were looking at it, it looked like something redacted. Some people decided to take that and actually put it onto an image. So it would actually look like an actual document rather than somebody just posting something in a thread. Other people did that same idea with emails. So they would write it out like an email, or they would put it to make it look like an image, like someone did a screenshot of an actual email. Again, sometimes with redactions, sometimes not, typically from some kind of government organization that was trying to hunt the Slender Man or something. You had newspapers. People would write out things like they were a newspaper article about something that happened. Somebody else would find it and go, this is really cool. And so then they would put it in so it would look like a scanned image of a newspaper that would then have the newspaper story. Essentially, what I'm getting to is a lot of these stories are playing with ideas of the reality of the story. So they wanted to kind of create an urban legend that would kind of live on outside of itself, that people would inherently believe to be true. But it was also just a fun way of telling stories. So if you think about this as like when you go camping, and you're sat around a campfire and you're telling stories to your friends about the scary stories to kind of spook each other because it's at night in a campfire. You don't start the story by going, well, we all know this is made up. And my sister told me this one when I was like 5 and it kind of spooked me. So let me tell it to you. Anyway, here's the story. You're not going to do that because it's going to break everything and it's going to not carry the same weight as someone going, oh, I heard that there was a girl at our school who went missing because of this thing. And then you tell the story and everyone goes, ah, and they run and they go back to away from the campfire. But everyone knows that campfire story was fictional. They all know it was made up, but it's in the moment when you're sat around the campfire, it's more fun to live within that moment of as if real. And so that's kind of where these stories are being taken from, is this idea of playing with as if reality, even though everyone knows it is reality, or everyone knows it's fiction, which is the opposite of, anyway. So basically what's happening is in the process of telling these stories, the categories between reality and fiction were what was starting to break. And the Slenderman was supposed to exist in this weird middle ground of between the ideas of reality and fiction. He really thrived in those spots. But what happened when people started to continue to tell these stories and to continue to find new locations to tell them and to kind of spread it to all sorts of different other areas of the internet, and it started to kind of proliferate, was that there was an additional category breaking that was inherently tied to this idea of reality and fiction. And that was the separation between the virtual and the physical. So again, these ideas of photoshopping is essentially a blurring between the physical and the virtual worlds. You're taking something that is an actual photo that was taken in the real world and is shifting it. You're manipulating it digitally in order to fit a type of other reality that exists in the virtual fictional sphere. So what they were doing was essentially blurring this reality between the physical and the virtual, playing with the idea also that a community getting together online is inherently starting to become normal. And I say starting to become normal, not now, but in 2009. In 2009, the idea of a community group online wasn't quite there yet, but it was starting to be. And so the idea of a group of people kind of all experiencing the same issues or the same weird thing, kind of getting together and saying, well, this is what I found, what have you found, was starting to become a thing. So they're starting to blur those realities. And there's an important connection that happened between the two dichotomies of the reality and fiction and the physical and virtual, which is that the reality was inherently tied to the physical world and the fictional was inherently tied to the virtual. And this is something that actually has still held on a lot of spheres when it comes to dealing with things online. I think I don't know how much you guys like hang out on different online groups and stuff, but sometimes when you're chatting with someone online, you might use the phrase, well, in my real life, I do this thing for a living, or in my real life, I like to, shoot archery or whatever it is that you're talking about. And essentially what you're saying is in my offline, time when I'm not on Reddit, what I like to do is I like to do this other thing. Or what I do for my job when I'm not on Reddit is do this other thing. But it makes it sound as if the life that you're in that moment when you're having that conversation is somehow unreal in comparison to the real life that you're contrasting it to. So this is something that still happens, but it was inherently more of a thing in 2009. And I forgot to flip to this image. This is another Slenderman image. I just thought I would flip to it in order to help break up the monotony of the same picture for a while. This is another one from Victor Surge, but this one came out like in either 2017 or 2019. I can't quite remember the date. But he kind of came back and did a couple of more photos a little bit later. So this came way after the fact, but I think really fits the same styling of it. And, you know, he's good at what he does when it comes to Photoshops. So yeah, this is just kind of another example of it. But yeah, so you would start to kind of see this breaking down of the boundaries between reality and fiction, and the physical and the virtual. And the Slenderman really thrived in the broken middle ground between those two categories. He lived in that rubble. He loves to play in that kind of shadowy boundary line. That's where he really thrives, because that was scary in 2009. Now, I know that in Romancing the Gothic group, there's probably a lot of you that are very interested in very historical things. So it's going to sound very strange for me to talk to you about how I had to do a bit of historical studies when I'm looking back at 2009. But 2009 on the internet is like going back in time, because a lot of things have changed both socially as well as technologically from 2009. You know, I think I used the example this morning of the fact that on Facebook in 2009, Facebook still hadn't opened itself up to people that didn't have a .edu email address. So it was still closed off to people. It was only for college, like university students at that time, which is crazy to think about now. In fact, I don't know if there's many people on Facebook who were even around on the internet at the time when it was like that. So there's been a huge shifts in a lot of areas for this. And in 2009, the idea of online communities was really weird. If you had a friend that you only really spoke to online, it would be shady. It would not be considered a good thing. And I'm sure a lot of people would be worried for your safety. It was something that was seen as inherently bad. And there was probably something wrong with you if you couldn't make friends in the physical world, if all of your friends were in the virtual world. There was something wrong with you. And the idea of a community existing inherently online was really strange. And so these communities that were forming inherently online were in this really strange, anxious middle ground that was shaky, that was uncertain, and that was viewed from very many people in the offline world to be not real. So the communities themselves were essentially also monstrous in the fact that they kind of lived in this middle ground. And the Slenderman really encapsulated that. He was the figurehead for this weird, anxious 2009 internet time frame. And this is what brings me to a conversation about the internet as a place of wilderness and as a place on the forest. So going back to traditional storytelling real quick, in traditional storytelling, the forest is typically a place of transformation. This is something that you find a lot, particularly in old Germanic folklore. So there's been quite a lot of really detailed studies and analyses of the stories collected by the Brothers Grimm, for instance, and quite a lot of the detailing of the forests in those stories and what role the forest had in those stories. And the forest in these stories were a place of transformation. And this holds true for a lot of ritual studies as well. So a lot of rituals, you go out into the forest and then you come back changed. So you're in your village and you're a boy, and then you go out into the forest and you experience something, some kind of weird ritual that is outside of the societal constraints. And then you come back to society transformed as a man. Now you are a man. And that only happened because you went into the forest, had your experience, and then you came back. The thing is that you have to leave in order to do that, because in the forest, society has no control. in the forest, you are outside of the societal oppression and the societal constructions, societal categories, if we go back to that idea. And in this world, things can happen and you can change, and you can change for the better. You can come back a man, which in these societies is a good thing. Or you can go out into the forests and you can get eaten by a monster, because the forest is inherently away from society and is therefore scary and is therefore a place where monsters roam. That's where the werewolf will get your grandma. It's not in your strong village with the guards and the big walls. It's outside in the forest, away from everyone else, away from society. That's where the werewolf will get you. And so the forest is this place of transformation, but it's also a place of monsters. For 2009, the internet is a forest. The internet is the wilderness. The internet is the place away from society. It still is for a lot of instances, particularly when you look at 4chan. And these are areas away from society. You go into it and you're no longer in your real life, and you are no longer in this kind of determining factor. Typically, you would have a completely different name. You would go out there, you would live your life, and you could either come back transformed or you could get eaten by monsters. And as life went on, as the internet moved on, the view of the wilderness, of the internet wilderness, began to change, because we know that monsters roam on the internet. We know that monsters are in the forest. But as time goes on, those monsters become a lot more solid. They become a lot more focused. We seem to understand their realities in certain ways, in very different ways. And we start to see that the internet is itself a monster. The forest is no longer the place of monsters. The place of monsters has now become so full of monsters that it is a monster itself. Now, I'm not saying that I think that the internet is all full of terrible people. I'm saying this is the view, typically, more generally speaking, of the internet as time has gone on. And this is really encapsulated by another monster that I'm going to be talking about, which is the monster Momo. Momo started, I think, in about 2018, maybe 2017. But really gained really gained steam in 2019. So in 2019, the story started being circulated amongst particularly troubled parents. They started becoming aware that there's this story, that there's this character Momo that exists on children's areas online, and they would kind of pop up and they would start to dare the children to do different things. And essentially the dares would culminate in the child's suicide. And I do kind of, there's something really interesting about suicide in creepypastas, but I think that's a whole nother conversation for another time with probably a lot more content warnings. But that's essentially what the story of Momo was. And now I want to specify here that there's no instance, there's no reports, there's nothing that exists in reality, and I'll use that phrase, that there were ever any children who were actually harmed. That's why I don't mind talking about this, because there were no children harmed by this. It was a story. It was a story just as much as the Slender Man is a story, just as much as every other monster that we can talk about is a story. But the difference between the Slender Man and Momo is inherently in our view of the wilderness. When the Slender Man was kicking around, he was one monster within a kind of strange forest where anything could happen and we didn't really understand it. Momo came about when the internet was a monster. Momo came about when the forest itself was a monster. And so suddenly, it wasn't just a monster that may or may not exist and we're not really sure and we should probably look into it. It was so believed that it was immediately picked up on and that people started to react against it as if it was real. And there was a lot of really negative consequences to this that I'm not going to get into. But essentially, the reason why it came about this way is because of the fact that people were viewing the internet as a monster itself. And I think I'm actually gonna leave it there. I think I know that's kind of a sudden place, but that's kind of what it culminates into. Is you have this kind of growth of monsters where the Slenderman is kind of this amalgamous thing, and then Momo is this such a solid figure, and Momo is this kind of encapsulation to me of how people view the internet, particularly parents view the internet as this inherently scary, terrible place that the reason why we are so inherently able to believe this is because it is a monster, and it is a monster that is there purely to hurt people. And there's no more wink wink nudge nudge. There's no more fun as if storytelling. There's no more of that kind of play. People are mistaking play as basically, before there's a playing with belief, which is a really fascinating thing that happens all the time anyway. But I think people have stopped realizing that people can play with belief and started believing that people just believe, full stop. And so that's where Momo comes in, and that's where Momo really lives and has only been able to thrive because of this view. So yeah.